In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to make a replacement record weight for your Seeburg 1000 background music system. The problem with these record weights is they tend to get lost in these machines. These machines were made 50 years ago, and this is what the record weight looks like. It's described as original Seeburg part 233167, and it was made from 3/32 inch stamped steel with a zinc chromate finish, that kind of yellowish finish. And it was painted in what they called Wedgwood. That's what this kind of robin's egg blue is. It's called Wedgwood in their documentation. So the thing is, if you've got a Seeburg 1000 without this record weight, you can get away with putting something else up there, but it's just incomplete. And this is a really easy part to replace. So what I've got here is a drawing that I prepared, and you'll see we have the record weight itself, the dimensions, 7.625 inches wide, and these are all going to be imperial because this was made 50 years ago. And the hole in the center is exactly 2 inches wide. That matches the spindle of the Seeburg 1000. I'm going to make this out of brass because it's easy to work with material. I have a piece of it right here, and it's something that many of us could work with hand tools. And so here's the piece of brass that I bought. It's 3/32 inch thick. It cost me, I don't know, like $30, $40, something like that. And it's pretty heavy, and it's going to make a nice weight. It's the same kind of thickness as the steel. It's a little bit heavier. The machine is not going to notice that. The problem that I'm going to face is, how do I get that big hole in the center? Now the outer edge is pretty easy to take care of. I'm going to use a bandsaw and maybe a little belt sanding action before I take it over to the lathe, because I don't want these sharp edges flinging around. But how do you mount it on the lathe? And how do you get that hole in the center? So my plan is I'm going to drill a hole in the middle of this, and I'm going to put a bolt with a washer, and I'm going to use this piece of steel as a mandrel. I'll drill a hole in the end of the steel and thread it and put the brass on the end, and that's going to give me a fairly good way of holding it. Not the most secure way. This is not going to be something that I want to put any level of stress on, so I'm going to be taking super light cuts, and it may very well be a big fail. Now about that center hole. What I'm thinking of doing is, once I get this done and I've got the donut shape cut like that, I will then put it on the milling machine and use a boring head to bore this out until it's at that 2 inch dimension. It's kind of a specialty tool to have. Not everybody has a boring head, and not everybody has a milling machine, but my lathe is small. There's no way that I'm going to fit this. I don't have jaws big enough to hold this thing. Even though the swing of the lathe is 9 inches, I don't have any chuck that I could chuck this in. All right, before we get too far, it's probably a good idea for me to mark this thing up a little bit. So it doesn't need to be precise, because I'll just leave generous amounts of metal, and then I will make it precise on the lathe. So I'm just going to, just so I know what I'm doing, let's mark up using our reel pad as a template. And then I sanded it pretty well here, so I know I take that off, I should be able to like so. We'll do that. And do that. Yeah, that looks about right. Let's go to the shop. Cutting out the brass was pretty easy. Getting these corners off, rather trivial. The only thing I had issues with was little chunks of brass falling down into the slot underneath the blade, but that was not a serious problem. Then came the sander, and about 2 minutes of this and the rough edges were off. Now I'm making the mandrel that I'm going to use to hold the record weight. Taking a facing cut. I'm drilling and tapping for a 5/16 24 bolt. That's the size I had on hand. Using a collet here. I like using collets because they center the work really well, and you don't need to change the chuck size or anything like that. It's a really convenient way to work with small round stock. Had a bit of a hassle getting this threading to work because I don't have a proper handle for this that's big enough. All of my handles are small T handles, so I just put it in the chuck and it starts slipping, and I had to do it by hand. I was afraid to start the lathe up. It just was going to be a mess. That's a bottoming tap. I had to use the taper tap first, and then I ran the bottoming tap in. Test fit, moment of truth. Was it deep enough? And yes, it was. Perfect. So this is how it's going to work. I'm going to have this disc with a hole in it. I'm going to put one washer on one side, bolt on the other, and the disc will be held about right there. It's going to be pretty far out. It's going to be scary looking, and I'm going to step back as I run the lathe and I turn this thing in order to get a nice smooth edge here. I know I could just run this on the belt sander and file it. That would take quite a bit of time. I've got a lathe that can do this, just barely, so why don't I do it? So I'm spot drilling and then drilling a 19/64 hole because I'm going to ream it to the 5/16 size that I need for the bolt. And there we go. The scary looking turning happening. It's actually not that bad. It went very smoothly. Only took about maybe 10 minutes to turn this down to size. Filed the edge and then I sanded it. I was going to polish it shiny, then I looked at this and said, you know, I like this finish. So I decided to keep this finish. Now I got to make that hole. This is the plan that didn't work. So I have to use a dial indicator in order to get the center of the milling machine centered on that hole so that my large hole that I make will be perfectly concentric. And you see I'm dialing it in. That indicator shows within 1/1000th of an inch. And I just check side to side, front to back, use a little mirror, and use the hand wheels of the mill to get everything perfectly in position. Then I get the boring head out, mount that in the milling machine, and go ahead and bore a 2-inch hole. Yeah, that didn't work. You probably can't see it, but the whole milling machine is shaking. Everything is shaking. Everything's rattling. This was not going to work. It's going to take me all day long, and the whole machine was rattling to bits. This machine just doesn't have the rigidity needed to do a hole like that. So let's move on to plan B. So this is plan B. So I'm going to have to put a hub with Loctite right there and then grip the hub. That's the only way I'm going to be able to get a boring bar in here and a rigid enough setup so that I can cut this. So this is how I center it in the 4-jaw chuck. These chucks have 4 independent jaws, and the challenge is that you need to adjust each one of them in order to get the piece right in the center. So the way this is done is a bit of a fiddly process where you adjust opposite jaws, and you have this dial indicator that's showing you how far off opposite jaws are from each other. And when you're done, that needle should be absolutely rock solid as you spin the piece. And you typically can get the part within less than 1/1000th of an inch of center. The pros can do this really fast. Home gamers like me, it takes a little bit longer. All right, look at that. Look at that. Now the big problem is going to be keeping this thing attached to the piece of aluminum as I bore it. We'll see if it works. All right, here I am, just boring away, hoping that doesn't break free. What I didn't know was that my boring bar had a broken tip on it, and that wasn't helping things. Luckily, the part wasn't damaged. Gorilla Glue to the rescue. It's a much stronger glue than the Loctite that I was using. .309. Let's try again. Go a little angle. A tip backward. Then pull it through the top, like that. I've got 1.309 right now. Yep, 1.309. Looking good. So there it is. I've got this aluminum Gorilla glued to the plate, and I'm going to take my torch and go somewhere else and heat this thing up, and hopefully it'll fall right off. Okay, and that worked admirably. There it is. It just, after it got hot enough, it broke free. Now I just need to figure out how to get this stuff off. Hopefully acetone will do the trick. If not, I will end up sanding or something. The good side looks good. Worst case scenario, this is the ugly side. I'll just put my pad on here and nobody will ever see this stuff. And it worked. Here I am cutting a new pad for this using the old manual technique. Bit of a challenge to get this centered on the part, and you want to make sure not to stretch it any as you're doing this, because then you get buckling as you get towards the end. There we go. So how did it turn out? Here is an original Seeburg record weight, and here is my version. You will notice that the bottom, I didn't sand it because this is going to be the bottom anyway. What I did to get all that gunk left by the Gorilla Glue was I simply used a razor blade and scraped it off, and it left these lines that aren't gouges, they're simply scrape lines. And I figured nobody cares about that. I don't need to figure out how to sand this thing on the lathe or something like that. Sometime in the future I will do that, because I do want to give it a nice shine and then put some kind of lacquer on it to protect the finish. For now, this is how it looks, and it's going to look pretty nice on the machine. I'll show you that in a couple minutes. I do want to point out a change in the drawing. If you'll notice, I've circled this dimension here. That's the size of the hole. It was originally 2 inches on the drawing, but of course the platter has to fit on top of the spindle, and the spindle is 2 inches wide, and well, the hole in the platter, when I measured the original one, came out to be 2.006. They probably had 5 thousandths over on their original drawing, and so that's what I did. 5 thousandths over, and that should work if anybody ever makes one of these. Let's go see what it looks like on the machine. Isn't that a thing of beauty? That's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching.